1109897, Ontario, Inc. Will was on his way home. He walked down Roncesvalles Avenue on the eastern border of High Park. Percy had met him at the cinema. She had called a few days before. She always gave good lead time when she wanted to see him. She understood a busy life. She had a busy life. They saw each other less and less, sometimes only once in a month. Their relationship had not progressed or regressed. They still occupied a kind of primal intimacy that centered around his vision and her suicide attempt. She never spoke about graduate school or Mrs. Rabini, and he never spoke about cigarettes or investment scheduling. They both saw an eerie reflection of themselves in the other. He saw the expectations that she had to live up to, the non-stop worry. She saw the collapsed will of someone just like her, someone who couldn't take the pressure of being precocious. There was a change in her, he thought, not between that night at the cinema and the last time he had seen her, but in general. She was moving in a direction he couldn't quite define. Her attire was plainer every time he saw her. That night at the cinema, she had worn a baggy sweater and a long wool skirt. Gone were the expensive shoes she had been wearing when he first met her, as though she was living by some clock that was counting down her life. In their place were heavy winter boots, flat at the heel. She wore a down-filled jacket with a hood, a wool hat, a wool scarf, and wool gloves. It was cold, but not that cold. She looked eccentric. There was more than just the dress, too. She seemed to be getting more intense each time he saw her, as though she were living by some clock that was counting down on her life. When he was with her, he felt the presence of death, just as he had felt it in the church with Mrs. Duncan. There was a chill in the air, a cool wind that blew under his jacket. He kept his hands in his pockets. The streets were still alive. He and Percy had seen the first evening show at the cinema. It was just 9 p.m. He stopped in at a coffee shop and had a coffee and a slice of carrot cake. His vision occupied him most. It always did after he saw Percy. It made him feel naked somehow. It had redefined his whole perspective, but it had not come to any definition in and of itself. And it was why he persisted in a reverential interpretation of the vision. It was mystical to him. A communion with some intelligence that was of him but beyond him. And this sense of the mystical, charged with all of the emotion that evoked in him, manifested in his view of the world as some naked truth, allowable to him only by the sustainment of the idea that there was more, and that people were not an end in and of themselves, the final administrators of all they discovered. He thought about Percy. He thought about her sadness, her beauty in that sadness, and the kind of person he was, one that found sadness beautiful. The news was on a small television set that sat on a brace in a corner of the ceiling. The volume was low, and he could not hear anything that was being said. But the way news stories were put together, they were easy enough to understand without hearing everything. There was a village of several thousand that had been hacked to death with hatchets by extremists. There was more talk of unsafe water in Canada. There was great unrest from Mecca to Jerusalem. China was working on putting men in space. An oil company ran a tanker aground in the north, and locally, a 5-year-old boy had to watch helplessly as his terrier was torn apart by a pit bull. The human economy was a mess. A person is defined, Will reasoned, by what they can define, and, more importantly, by how they define things. If nothing else, his vision, a stream, a bright light, a crow, a black bear, a crucifix, a stone, and purple flowers, had allowed him new possibilities for experience, because by not allowing itself to be defined, and yet persisting in him as a passion, the vision forced him to consider all things undefinable. And, as an analyst is trained to do, and an economist is little more than an analyst, he analyzed, and all the time, at some new level, some meta level, and what he saw stayed in him, and everything he observed became part of him, and his mind at every level worked on the grander algorithms, the greater patterns that existed. If they could be interpreted, they could be evidence of God's economy, because, he concluded, if a God exists, then God would have an economy, a way of exchanging goods and services with that which it created, which, by the logic of a needs-based economy, as there are no other kinds, was the need God must have had when it created humanity. Although the creator of all economies, the need to communicate with humanity, placed God on the demand side of the exchange. Because, despite God's legitimate claim of patent holder on all things seen and unseen, the patent could not generate God a profit, because God was on the demand side. the one who needs, evidenced by God's need to communicate with humanity, which, to Will's sensibilities, seemed like the thing that disrupted the human economy more than anything else, God's desire to communicate with it. But given the disruption his vision had created in the economy of his life, he could easily understand the need to make room for God in the economy. After all, he'd be a hypocrite if it were otherwise. He wondered where Robert Polsky had gone. He had been stopping by the Gladstone Hotel with some regularity, but Robert was never there, and the front desk guy never knew where he was. He got up and left the coffee shop. The chill evening was a balm upon his mind. The simple pleasure of a biting wind was all that was needed to bite back on the biting mind. But it still seemed to him that happiness was a near impossibility. He went through his mind and tried to think of all the people he knew who were happy. There were none. There were just those who seemed to find a place, a corner of reality to hold on to by ritual and routine. The human economy was a mess. The dreams of human beings are the boundaries of an economy, and that meant there was a profound responsibility in dreaming. If the pursuit of space endangered the Earth in terms of its ability to sustain human existence, there would have to be a market correction before the Earth was destroyed. Because any economist knows that the dreams of an economy are the dreams of the living, not the dead. If he could see it, then they could see it. The oxygen market was a reality, and he decided there and then on his walk home to schedule meetings with investment clerks at the various Latin American embassies, consulates, and chambers of commerce. Oxygen was the way to go, and 1109897 Ontario Inc. was in a good position to commence the acquisition of royal estate, real wealth in Latin America. He walked around the corner at King and Queen Street. It was the nicest part of the walk, so close to the lake, and the wind was so cool and so invigorating, and there wasn't much traffic, and the street walkers weren't out to harass his walk home. As he walked past a particularly dark part of King Street, where there was a large gap in the lights, because of the spacing, and because of the trees that grabbed up the light before it could find a clear path to the street, he started to cry, and he thought, that poor little dog, and that poor little 5-year-old boy. At that precise moment, Cobb came around the corner, returning from distributing smokes to the convenience stores on Roncesvalles Street. There were still a few stubborn customers that refused to deal with anyone but him. He stopped in his tracks and said, I need you to take 32 cartons, assorted brands, to Mr. Kim tomorrow morning. Use the big black shoulder bag, and don't take any shit about money. He pays when he gets the smokes, not when he sells them. You can't be leaving without cash anymore. We're not the fucking government, you know. Okay, Will said. Cobb stepped in a little closer to Will, and he saw the water in his eyes, and he said, What the fuck is the matter with you? End of chapter.